Right, it's time for Focus. Today we have a report from South Sudan. 2 years after independence in 2011, a civil war started. There was a peace deal in 2015, but fighting resumed last year with accusations of ethnic cleansing. In February, the UN declared famine in parts of South Sudan. It says the government is preventing aid reaching hundreds of thousands of people. Simona Foltlin reports.
Despite appearances, Peter Ball got lucky. The shrapnel from a rocket-propelled grenade that hit his foot could have been lethal had it landed elsewhere on his body. Just months after the UN warned that South Sudan was at risk of genocide, fighting has escalated in many parts of the country. Dozens of wounded were brought to this hospital in Kodok after government forces took control of previously rebel-held Wau-Shiluk, located in the north of the country, just an hour drive from here. Nobody knows how many died. The government has accused the rebels of using civilians as human shields and of provoking the clashes. Peter Ball tells a different version of events.
What happened was that the government attacked us, and that's when the fighting started. We didn't really know what was going on. They're the ones who came where we were, and they attacked us.
Wau-Shiluk, pictured here in 2015, used to be a sanctuary for ethnic Shiluk fleeing fighting and growing tensions over land with the Dinka, South Sudan's largest tribe, and that of President Salva Kiir. The Shiluk believe that the most recent military campaign is part of a long-term plan to drive them from their land. This rebel soldier was wounded during the latest fighting. He plans to return to the front lines as soon as possible. For him, fighting the government is a matter of survival.
This is my land. I don't care about politics. My problem is about our lands. If they return our lands, which has been ours for a long time, then I don't have any other issue.
What's happened here is part of a worrying trend across South Sudan. Smaller tribes accuse President Kiir's Dinka-dominated government of ethnic cleansing. Violence has been on the rise since July last year, when fresh fighting between government and opposition forces in the capital Juba shattered a 2015 peace deal signed between President Kiir and rebel leader Riek Machar. Machar was driven out of the country, but the Shiluk forces loyal to him refused to accept it.
They must revise this agreement, see what is the weak side, what they can do, because we want them to bring Riek Machar, because Riek Machar is here living in some force outside. The whole opposition is still outside under Riek Machar. Nobody can take Riek Machar out of that because we are still loyal to him.
The most recent fighting unleashed a new wave of mass displacements. Tens of thousands who fled Wau-Shiluk now hide in the bush near the border with Sudan, where there is relative safety, but not much else.
We are exhausted from the wind and we are hungry. There's no food here. I've been waiting on this water pump since the morning to get water, but there isn't enough for everyone, and the quality is very bad.
For weeks, people have been sleeping out in the open with little to protect them from the elements. Everything they owned was left behind when their villages came under fire.
When we left Wau, we ran away with just the clothes on our back. We didn't even put on proper shoes. We left everything in our houses, including all of our harvest. The government has now taken everything that we left behind.
To survive, the displaced have been forced to eat whatever they can find in the bush. They are now among 5 million South Sudanese at risk of severe food insecurity. Aid would reach them a few days after we left. It had taken weeks to secure the necessary flight assurances, pushing many to the brink of starvation. The UN has accused the government of deliberately blocking aid to civilians in rebel-held areas. After extensive negotiations to gain access, aid also reached Gaëlle, one of 2 counties where famine has been declared. Over 300,000 people showed up to food distributions like this one, braving the scorching heat, some walking for days to get here. Many haven't had a proper meal in weeks.
I got some food from the Red Cross last month, but it was very little. It lasted us just a few days. So we went down to the riverbanks and looked for water lilies. Sometimes we'd also eat the palm fruits from the trees.
Although aid has arrived, the fight for survival isn't over. These rations will only last a month, and it's uncertain when aid agencies will be allowed back.
This place has been having regular fighting, and so what we've had is that humanitarian organizations have not been able to be stable here. They come in, then there is fighting, they lose all of their equipment, their material, they have to move out, the population flees, and all of that, so it's become very difficult to reach them.
People also fear the armed groups. Whenever she gets food, gunmen show up at Nianai Riek's house to take it.
Of course I'm worried someone will come and take the food. They come to your house and will beat you until you give it to them. One time they even hit me here. Then they took all the food.
While aid has brought some respite, it's not a solution to the conflict. As long as fighting rages on, aid agencies worry that more people will be at risk of famine in the months to come.
Joining me now is Jonathan Pednor, the South Sudan researcher with the Africa Division at Human Rights Watch. Hello, thank you very much indeed for joining us on today's Focus. Now, what evidence is there? What evidence does Human Rights Watch have of ethnic cleansing in South Sudan?
Well, this is not a term that we've used in our past reporting. We have seen numerous cases of atrocities being caused or committed on the basis of ethnicity, lots of killings, rapes, and that to us is indicative of the very ethnic nature of this conflict and of the fact that both parties have been playing into ethnic narratives in order to advance their gains. But the term ethnic cleansing per se is not a term that we ourselves have chosen to use so far.
Why not?
Well, I think the situation is extremely complicated, and what is clear is that in South Sudan we have seen numerous instances of war crimes and potentially even of crimes against humanity. I think it will be better better left to judges and courts to eventually decide of the precise nature of those crimes. We've seen repeated patterns clearly of killings, of forced displacements, of the destruction of homes and other civilian infrastructures, occupation of schools, occupation of hospitals. It's quite clear that both belligerents have no positive intent when it comes to dealing with civilian populations that they see as being supportive of the fight that they're fighting against, of the side that they're fighting against. But when it comes to the use of terms such as ethnic cleansing, which is not a legal term, or the term genocide, I think those are determinations that will be best left for courts to make when they have, or if hopefully they have, access to all of the evidence.
You're saying that neither side is really looking out for civilians, but you mentioned war crimes, crimes against humanity. Which side are we talking about? Both?
Well, throughout the war, both sides have been responsible for an enormous amount of abuses. But it's quite clear that, over the past year or so, government forces have committed the bulk of abuses. Government forces have been conducting and prosecuting extremely abusive counterinsurgencies in the south of the capital, in the equatorial region. And the famine that we're seeing right now in the center of the country, in the north center of the country, is a direct result of government offensives that took place in 2015, during which large numbers of civilians were driven out of their homes, villages were burned to the ground, hundreds of thousands of heads of cattle were stolen by government soldiers and government-affiliated militias who were trying to dislodge, or pretended as though they were trying to dislodge, opposition forces from that region, which is also the region from where the chief of the opposition, Riek Machar, comes from originally. So I think it's quite clear that for the past year or so, government forces have committed the bulk of abuses, and we've been repeatedly calling on the international community and the UN to impose sanctions and consequences over the government in Juba and over a number of commanders, both in the opposition and in the government, who are responsible for such abuses.
Why do you think these calls that you mentioned there on sanctions are falling on deaf ears? I mean, it doesn't really seem like the international community is doing a lot, and the UN says that the government isn't even letting aid get through.
Well, indeed, I mean, and that's precisely, the very cynical situation that we're in, whereby the international community is being asked to, fund this massive relief effort that's needed to respond to the famine, that's needed to respond to the destruction that has been caused by both of those parties. And yet, because of dissensions within the UN Security Council between Russia, China, and the US, we're not seeing any progress in terms of imposing sanctions against commanders or imposing an arms embargo. And there's a need to remind everyone that the main while paying for this massive relief effort, the government chooses to continue to spend an enormous amount of its national budgets on the prosecution of that war, on paying its soldiers, on acquiring new weapons and new ammunitions.
All right, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed for joining us from Human Rights Watch, Jonathan Pedno.